Thanks, Glenn. I'm Emily Gore, and Mark Baggett and I from the University of Tennessee are going to get us started talking about thinking about the Digital Library of Tennessee in light of the Change Discovery API. So just to give some background about early US digital libraries, many projects were funded by IMLS or using LSTA dollars at the state level. Most were focused on state themed content, but some included content held in state repositories despite the theme of the content. Very few large-scale projects outside of the geography focus, so outside of state bounds, happened. There were a few exceptions to that, including things like the Civil Rights Digital Library at the University of Georgia. Projects were either hosted in a single repository, this was a less likely thing, but it did happen, or they were metadata only projects. States rarely work together, often in part due to LSTA funding restrictions, as well as mission and goals of institutions being state or institution focused. So much of this kind of general landscape that I've talked about of US digital libraries, collaborative projects in the past, the Digital Library of Tennessee has followed. So the Tennessee Documentary History Project was one of those central repositories. So one of those that I talked about being less rare, but that was a way to get people to work together to provide access to the actual content. Then we had Volunteer Voices, which was also kind of a central portal, and then the Volunteer Voices portal, which added screen scraping and was a metadata only for a broader search. Then that led to the Digital Library of Tennessee as part of the DPLA hub structure being established as a metadata only aggregation using OAI-PMH across the state. So that really reflects kind of where we are now. The Digital Library of Tennessee serves as a DPLA service hub, and that means here at the University of Tennessee, we aggregate data from across the state, from different institutions, museums, libraries, archives throughout the state. We map descriptive metadata into a single common format. Shout out to Meredith Hale, who is on this call, who is our metadata librarian who does a lot of this work. And we share common metadata with DPLA, including thumbnails. So when the Tennessee decided to initially participate in DPLA, the benefits were discussed. The ability to share metadata about content with DPLA on a quarterly basis. So there's a quarterly pull of our data, of our OAI-PMH, so we can update it on a regular basis and add new content. Increase discovery by being available through the DPLA portal, and increase reuse by being available, having our data in the DPLA API. And if you'll remember early on, many people got together and built applications around the DPLA API, where you could find, all things that were green, for example, in the DPLA in the thumbnails. The ability to have our content be a part of DPLA exhibits and primary source sets was extremely important at the Tennessee state level, and to be a part of a larger network of institutions doing the same kind of work, a platform to actually discuss best practices and where we could go together. That's really what the benefits, where we saw the benefits of DPLA participation. As DPLA grew, some of its features grew. One of them was the development of a concept called DPLA Local, which basically gave a front end and look at DPLA, a slice of DPLA content. And in this case, our slice is the content contributed by the Digital Library of Tennessee. So we have our own portal, and it has a fairly simple front end where you can search the content contributed. That is hosted by DPLA and did give us the advantage of being able to have this Tennessee-based portal without having to host or develop that. It does search metadata only and brings back results from the Digital Library of Tennessee. Where the hub and the portal fall short, we get really low return on investment and discovery of resources. The exhibits and the primary source sets utilizing hub content have no longer become a priority for DPLA. And that's where full items were actually used. And so that's where we actually saw more traffic because our full items were being pulled in and used. The portal delivers descriptive metadata only. After all, the metadata is the focus of OAIP MH. It's not optimized for search engine discovery. So I'm gonna turn it over to Mark and he's gonna tell you a little bit more about visions of where we're going.
Thanks, Emily. So Emily talked to us about the fact that we have a low return on investment. And I really want to talk about potential reasons for why that is and what low return on investment really is defined as for us. So each year we get about 1,000 referrals from the main DPLA portal back to our host site. And we get another 500 or so from that state portal. But we see that as being pretty low, and we think we have a pretty good reason for that. We don't have any full resources. What users get is they go to this statewide portal, they can do searches, they can find things, but what they find is a descriptive metadata in tiny thumbnails. You can see this kind of on the right here. It's kind of representative of some of what our partner institutions are able to provide to us. But essentially what we think that gives us is we get users who come here, they search for things. They may think, oh, this is cool, but ultimately it's just not a very useful tool. The thumbnail they interact with is hard to see. It requires an additional click to kind of get to and see what it is. So we don't know that we really get a lot of return use. Furthermore, we only think we really probably get people only discover this. The people who are coming to this portal to begin with. We don't think we have very good SEO. And I think part of the reason for that is we know SEO is driven primarily by high quality websites. And of course, here you see a kind of an example of a full results display where you have this low quality image and some descriptive metadata. Furthermore, our thumbnails themselves are treated as decorative images. Now, what do I mean by that? If you look at the HTML DOM itself and you look at one of these images, you have this image with an empty alt tag. And what that's telling a browser, a screen reader, etc., is that this image isn't really related to the descriptive content on the page. Instead, it's more like a background image. It's decorative. It's non-consequential. And for this reason, we think this probably further hurts our SEO. So how do we see IIIF providing solutions to these problems? We can use IIIF to discover and aggregate resources. I'm going to talk about how in just a moment. We can, of course, use the presentation API to present the full resource with descriptive metadata. We can provide attribution to the providing institution in numerous ways. And we don't have to host the full resource, which I think is good for us and also good for our partners because they don't want us to. And most importantly, maybe the providing institution gets that final hit so that they're getting credit for someone's discovering this to begin with. So how do we imagine our services evolving to be based on IIIF? So currently, the way Emily described this already, we mostly get content via OAIP-MH. We get it in a broad array of metadata formats and different flavors of those formats as well. And then ultimately we aggregate that in, we normalize it. That normalized record goes on to an index for DPLA, and that powers both portals. We see this changing by just getting rid of PMH and replacing PMH with Change Discovery. And why? Well, the second we switch to Change Discovery, we see that we no longer have descriptive metadata and thumbnails, but we also have a link to a presentation manifest that could be reused and re-indexed so that it could be powered in the portal itself. So just a bit about IIIF Change Discovery. The spec is defined as the API that provides the information needed to discover and subsequently make use of IIIF resources. The intended audience of the API is other IIIF aware systems that can leverage the content and the APIs. So we were pleasantly surprised to discover on Tuesday that Change Discovery had bumped from, I think, 0.93 to 1.0, which signifies to us that we are now saying, as the IIIF community is now stating, that this is no longer beta and is now stable, and I think, production ready. And what we want and what we're hoping to see now is different providers, digital library software, Content DM, Haiku and Hyrax, Islandora, etc., to start providing change discovery endpoints in the same way that we provided OEI PMH endpoints for years. In the bottom right here, we've added, we're so excited by the announcement that we threw together a quick little static site to pull level 0 activities together via the current spec so that you can get access to our resources there now. And that's just to hold us in place until we can get a full dynamic change discovery endpoint online. So how do we reimagine aggregation with change discovery? It's not all that different. What we see now is that the partner application, we think, will share with us a change discovery endpoint. We will process the collection of pages and pages activities to get to that IIIF manifest so that we can store that manifest for reuse later in the portal, but then also parse that for its see also references and ultimately get down to the descriptive metadata so that that can be normalized and then indexed to power search and browse. So this all sounds good, but obviously there's challenges for aggregation and delivery. I'm gonna talk about some of those now. Starting off with differing levels of activity. So the spec defines 3 different levels. Level 1, I think, is the one that we see as most closely aligned with maybe how we think about OEI PMH. Essentially, you get hey, this identifier or this manifest is online, and here was the last time it was updated. And the way that the spec says it should work is that when you make requests, those things that are most recently updated should be encountered first, which is very similar to maybe how list of identifiers works in OEI PMH. It also identifies level 2, which is really, really cool, has lots of different types to describe different activities. This resource has been moved, et cetera, et cetera. I think the thing that we are thinking about and recognize that if publishers are to use level 2, we'll definitely have to think about how an aggregation software will need to interact with this in order to make sense of what to do with a resource. Also leveraging see also references and manifest. So mostly I think aggregations is very similar the way that we envision it, but we also recognize is that we're going to need to do more requests. With OEI PMH, we use list records. You get the full descriptive metadata and you kind of just parse things that way. With change discovery, that's a little bit different. I think the idea is to use change discovery is to discover the presentation manifest, then discover from the presentation manifest what the see also reference is to the descriptive metadata, get that, and then normalize that and index it. Of course, that's a lot more requests, or more requests for sure. It's to some extent trivial, but it is a different, an additional level of complication. There's also differing flavors of how to interact with see also references. You can have more than one. People identify those in different ways. Of course, there's presentation 2 and presentation 3, and both are still, presentation 2 is still pretty popular. So we have to have some sense of what people are going to do. But I will say that this isn't that different than what we encounter right now with OEI PMH. We kind of get different metadata in different formats. So again, to some extent, it's trivial, just more requests. IIIF adoption. What do we do about institutions and applications that don't have IIIF support? So we have 2 providers right now that do not have any IIIF support. They use bpress or dspace. And we're trying to just figure out like, hey, is IIIF, does that become a hurdle for inclusion, or do we allow those groups to continue to serve things over something like OEI PMH and then just make the thumbnail and descriptive metadata available, but not the full resource? Probably the most complicated thing here, I think, and this is just us, I think, to me at least, have had trouble navigating access restricted materials. So from reading 4.2 of Change Discovery spec, it seems like you can't assume that something that's in a list of items is not restricted from access. And there is no type for like a level 2 activity to say that this thing is now restricted or whatever. And I think we're curious to figure out like how for use cases like us, like how the community thinks that you should deal with this. I'm also curious to see how publishers, things like Content DM might what it might look like in a change discovery endpoint for items that have been restricted. So next steps, what do we do to get to where we want to go? Well, first of all, we need to advocate for adoption of change discovery in different libraries and also in different library application software. Of course, to some extent, we already in our hub like track manifests that people have. So in some ways we could fake it by creating our own change discovery endpoint, but I don't really think that's what we want to do ultimately. Instead, we want to advocate for adoption and then monitor how different communities and platforms adopt the spec so that we can understand levels of activities so that we can build an aggregation software and ultimately a portal. And then once we have the portal together, of course, is to also adopt change discovery for sharing the resources that the portal gather together via change discovery as well. So I think we have just a couple minutes for questions, comments, and feedback, and we would love to hear any thoughts that you have in regards to the challenges that we see or what you're thinking about in terms of change discovery now that it is at 1.0.
Thank you. That's a great presentation. We've had one question on Hoover. Do you see that descriptive metadata and manifest is as standardized or extensive as you had with OOPMH, or is it even better?
So I'm going to try to answer this, and I would love to hear what other people think. But I think when you read the and maybe I'm missing the question a little bit, but when you read the presentation spec and the change discovery spec, I think one thing that you have to that is really pointed out there is that you need to use what the C also reference refers to and not the metadata section itself for the labels or whatever. In some ways, in my opinion, it's exactly the same hurdle. Every institution uses different ways of serialization of metadata and also uses just different flavors of that, like how they do whatever it is they do. So I don't really see any difference personally.
That's great, thank you. We've got a minute left, and Julian asks, what kind of structured metadata do you need in C also?
So I think, so I'm going to try to answer this a couple different ways. So I think the way that we think about is structure, and I think structure in a different way. So we use in our C also references structured metadata as well that kind of talk about how the resource itself relates to other things. But what we do mostly, and I guess the way I think about structured metadata, things like books and books of pages or compound objects with different pages, is really building out in the manifest themselves how you want delivery to be, and use things like structures and ranges, but also things like view direction, etc., to build out what that experience should be and what a viewer should do with that in your presentation manifest. I may have missed some of that, but or what was meant by that too. But we also have C also references that mention structural metadata that say like this page is a part of this book and this book is a part of this collection, and we share that in C also references as well.
Great, thank you, and a great presentation. I definitely encourage you to come along to the Discovery Technical Group. I'd love to hear your experiences. I'm afraid I'm going to have to call it an end there for the next session, but if you want to continue the discussion, the Hoover is the place to go and ask some questions. But thank you once again.
Thanks, everyone.